Brian Moran. Oh, okay. Although I suspect you may have been able to hear me. On behalf of then in addition to that, we're going to have a discussion with people who implement policies. Today we have, as you know, on the agenda, the CIOs from HHS and FDA. And then after that, we're going to have a perspective outside of government, and today that is going to be done by Todd Stottlemyre from Innova Health Services. So, you know, it's going to be an information-packed 2 hours, but again, we thank you for being here. If you've ever been involved in an event, you know you just can't do an event without sponsors, and we have 3 terrific sponsors today. Pure Storage, let's see, who is here from Pure Storage? Is Gary Newgard here? Gary, I guess, couldn't make it. And Pure Storage is a company that is a contractor to the government, and they are putting, let's see, they are leveraging the speed of flash technology and bringing efficiency to government. We have Worldwide Technologies here. And let's see, Ed Hieronymus. Ed, how are you? Thank you for being here. And Worldwide, they are our breakfast sponsors. Thank you for those delicious food. And they make procurement easier for government. And Trend Micro. And Trend Micro, we have Dana Rieger. And Trend Micro, a very good buddy of mine, runs a lot of their federal stuff there, Rich Waisgrass, and it's just an outstanding company that is synonymous with cybersecurity, all different levels of cybersecurity. So please join me in thanking all 3 of these terrific sponsors. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Camille. Why don't you come on up on the stage, Camille? She's going to have a one-on-one discussion with the good congressman. Before I turn it over, I just want to personally thank Congressman Connolly for being here. One, because he, as you saw, had a little issue with his leg, but he nevertheless agreed to fulfill his obligation and come here. And let me also say, as someone that's in this federal technology business, there is probably nobody on the Hill, on either the Republican side, the Democrat side, and the Senate and the House, that has a better understanding of the technology issues in government. And let's face it, if we ever want to achieve good government, efficient government, there may be no more important factor than technology, acquiring it efficiently, implementing it. And Congressman Connolly's name is attached to just about every significant piece of legislation that is impacting technology. So thank you for being here, Congressman. Okay, with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague and editor-in-chief of our magazine. And our magazine, by the way, is sort of a little different than the other media outlets out there, and they're good. But our approach is to be more of a thought leadership, thought-provoking content. And we want to present that content a little differently, so you'll see more and more video and multimedia aspects to it. And the person that is responsible for every single word, every single video, everything that you read on GovernmentCIO magazine is Camille Tutti. And I am thrilled that she's part of our team. So with that, please join me in welcoming Camille and Congressman Connolly.
Steve, I'm going to need that. This is going to be for you. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to see a jam-packed room. So welcome to our first CXO Tech Forum. We're so excited to have you here and to show you what we've been working on for the past few months, actually. So thank you, Congressman Connolly. It's a pleasure having you here. I know we're just in your neighborhood, so it wasn't that long of a trek here, right? So it's been an...
Well, actually, given our commute, I probably have one of the longest commutes of any member of Congress when we're in session.
So it's been a really interesting year. So federal IT has kind of gone mainstream. Suddenly you see publications like the Washington Post, USA Today cover issues like cyber attack, encryption, IT modernization. So can you give us a little bit of an overview what's kept you busy when it comes to congressional action and federal IT?
Well, first of all, I do want to say my condition is not permanent. I was in Romania for a NATO meeting. I head the U.S. delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, and many of you may remember the dictator of Romania's name was Ceausescu, and he had a very ugly end when the wall came down and Romania overthrew the communist government. And but one of his last acts was to build a palace that has almost as much square footage as the Pentagon. And it's been turned into the parliament of Romania. And it was raining, and Ceausescu spared no expense in this palace. So all the steps are marble. And I learned the hard way, rain and marble don't mix. So I went down, and this torqued and ripped out everything in the knee. So I'm recovering from that, in case it's not permanent. So yes, what keeps me busy? The foundation for congressional review and parameters of how we manage, procure, and retire IT in the federal government is going to be and is Vitara, also known as Isa Connolly or Connolly Isa, when he's not around. But that's the fundamental framework through which we're going to look at and measure progress. And as you know, we've set up a scorecard. Again, not to put a scarlet letter on anybody's back, but to try to goad and incentivize, our federal workforce to improve and to, reach for the stars. But more importantly, it's not a game. We want to make, as Steve said, the technology is a transformative process. It's not a commodity to be managed. Though it is also a commodity to be managed. And so how do we kind of get that mindset into the federal government? How do we start effectuating savings? And it's the low-hanging fruit alone is in the billions. And how do we try to make sure that we're using good management principles to allow people to reinvest in themselves if they, in fact, effectuate those savings? And there will be consistent congressional oversight, which was what was missing in the last sort of foundational legislation, which was known as Clinger-Cohen about 20, 25 years ago. Right after that bill passed, Clinger retired and Cohen became Secretary of Defense, where the idea of IT modernization and management just does not exist. Mm-hmm. And so we don't want to repeat that. We want to really establish a different kind of record.
And I would say that's one of the most important IT legislation, and Vitara aims to improve how the government manages and buys technology. So how was the process of pushing that through? What was it like, and what were some of the challenges you faced in trying to kind of encourage that?
In the House, we didn't really have a lot of challenges. I think in part, the unlikely pairing of Darrell Issa and Jerry Connolly, people looked at that going, well, if they can agree, who am I to take issue with it, Mm-hmm. But also the subject, this is both good and bad. The subject of IT management and procurement is so arcane that it wasn't like there were 100 actors wanting to put their imprint in this. And so we passed the bill unanimously 3 times in the House, on the House floor. Our problem was the Senate, getting them to take it seriously and do something about it. And also the other problem was just turf within Congress. We had to be careful that we weren't stepping on the armed services toes, because if we started extending the provisions too explicitly to the Pentagon, then we would have joint referral, which I know sounds like an inside baseball thing, and it is, but it would have probably killed the bill. So we had to stay out of their ball field while still using principles that could be applicable to the Pentagon as a matter of reform over time. So, but in terms of substantive problems, we had worked those out with industry and with government before we actually filed the bill. I personally spent about 4 months meeting with every stakeholder who wanted to talk to me about what their concerns were with the draft bill. And we pretty much worked those out.
That's excellent. So what has gone right with Vitara, and has it lived up to its potential?
I would say we've fallen short of potential for lots of different reasons. I'm disappointed in the progress, for example, on data center consolidation. There are billions of dollars to be saved. When we started out this process, I think Vivek Kundra back in '09 estimated there were like 1,200 data centers across the federal government. And what happened when we passed our bill and people had to meet metrics? Well, we got good at being more accurate about actually figuring out how many data centers we had.
And there were lots more.
Lots more. You probably know the number, Camilla. It's 12,000, close
yes,
to that.
12,000. Mm-hmm.
So the good news is we did get better in metrics. The not so good news is, well, the goal is consolidate them. Now, some agencies have really made great progress. So I'll give you the two extremes. And if you look at the 4 scorecards we've done already, USAID had a low score. They came to GAO, they came to us, and they said, how can we improve? And they took advice, they took it seriously, and they went from a low score to an A, high score you can get, in one cycle. Pentagon took a low score and made it lower. And they are now at an F. And they've managed to alienate almost all the players who care about Vitara and the implementation, including GAO. So we're disappointed in some respects, but we are glad that we are slowly empowering CIOs to be able to make decisions. And we are slowly, I hope, elevating the role of primary CIO so that he or she is reporting to the boss and not in the bowels of the agency, that we are beginning to see this more as a process than a commodity to be managed, that there are savings to be had. It's an iterative process. We weren't overly prescriptive in Vitara. Mm-hmm. For example, if I talk to the CEO of a company, I talk to one where's Todd Stottlemyre? Todd, how many CIOs does Innova Healthcare have? 1. Everyone see that? 1. We have 250 CIOs across 24 federal agencies. That's crazy by the private sector standards. Like, what? And what does that produce? This, right? No one's in charge. No one has to take responsibility. It was the other guy's fault. And that's maddening. So we have to move toward a hierarchy that is a modern management model that corporations like Todd's have been using for quite some time. And so getting rid of stovepipes, getting rid of duplication, getting rid of redundancy, retiring legacy systems would save probably or free up $40 to $50 billion a year. This is not chunk change. And that money could be reinvested in the enterprise to make us more efficient, more effective, as we're looking at an environment of constrained resources and budgets. This can be, a real tool for multiplying our ability to get the job done, and looking at new and innovative ways to get the job done. So it's in our own interest to do this. And we want to try to find ways at the congressional level, instead of doing it by fiat, how do we incentivize you? How do we back you up if you're that engine of change, so that we've got your back and we're incentivizing your agency and your managers to want to do the right thing? And that's the approach we've taken. And I think partly it's because most of us who are engaged in this come from the private sector originally.
So why the pushback? Why don't all the 24 CFO agencies have an A on these Vitara scorecards? Like, what is going wrong? Why aren't they doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, nothing is simple, right? So there are some agencies where a particular function or division of the agency dominates everything, mm-hmm. and they have separate authority from the real CIO for the agency. And so it distorts performance. I won't pick on anybody, but I can think of one at the Department of Transportation. And there are other CIOs who have not been empowered. They want to do the right thing. They want to really modernize their agency, but They don't have the attention of the boss. Remember that, I think it's only 11 of 24 CIOs, of major primary CIOs, have permanent status. We still don't have a White House CIO. We still don't have a White House CTO. So a lot of progress is not being made, and who has my back if I want to be that change agent? The other thing is, in a climate, the Trump budget has done some real damage here. When you've got a budget that cuts your agency 28%, 14%, 32%, and you're the person charged with at least ostensibly implementing that, I'm not sure a CIO coming to you saying, we really need to get rid of some of these legacy systems. Let's spend a couple of $1 billion you don't have on top of that 32% budget cut you got at Department of State or EPA, and move this right up to the top priority. You're really surrounded by alligators. You got all kinds of challenges. You're trying to keep the White House to know and be happy while also answering the Congress that's wondering what the hell are you thinking that you'd cut your budget like that. And you get a workforce that's nervous, and all those things to be managed. I think retiring legacy systems or making IT management procurement one of your top priorities just doesn't happen. It naturally sinks. And given the lack of infrastructure, management infrastructure in this administration so far in that regard, that makes it even worse. So these are all correctable things, but we've lost about 9 months of productive time.
So that brings me to the question of another important legislation that you worked on, the Modernizing Government Technology Act, whose goal is to bring the federal government into the modern era. So what is missing in order to get the government more up to current status?
You're talking about MGT?
Yeah.
Well, I love MGT, and I'm an original co-sponsor of it with Will Hurd, but it is a subset of Vitara. MGT was designed to do two things: create a work fund that could catalyze agencies to retire those legacy systems by having a little bit of working capital to do that. And secondly, to encourage agencies that effectuate savings by data center consolidation or otherwise through Vitara to be able to reinvest that capital instead of giving it back to the Treasury. That's all it does. And those are both good things. We think they're kind of modern management principles. We don't want to disincentivize agencies by, good news, you save $3 billion by doing all the right things. We're slashing your budget this year. Do it again. And then we wonder why performance, kind of sinks after the first round. So we want to try to apply common sense, modern management principles that incentivize behavior we want to achieve rather than disincentivize it. And that's really what MGT is designed to do.
What are some of the technologies you see as most disruptive or impactful when it comes to modernizing the federal government?
Disruptive. Well, I don't know if there's a specific technology that's disruptive or most disruptive, but I would say the biggest challenge we face, and by the way, it's not limited to the federal government, it's in the private sector too, as we just saw with Equifax, is cyber, cyber attacks. How do we protect against that? And the problem we've got in the federal government is that we have so many systems, multiple systems within a given agency, competing against each other, incompatible, can't communicate with each other, many of which are too old for modern encryption for protection. They are just vulnerable. And if you think about the databases the federal government has, I was talking to somebody, I think at CDC, and they get hundreds of millions of cyber attacks. They have, their mission is disease control and prevention and warning, right? They're not cyber experts. And they've had to create a whole new capacity to try to protect themselves against this onslaught that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that's one small federal agency. And you can only imagine what's going on at Treasury or Homeland Security or Department of Defense or divisions within the Department of Defense and so forth. But there are even federal agencies that are vulnerable we don't think about, but they matter. So take Department of Education. Department of Education is vulnerable. Its systems have not been fully modernized and so forth. Well, why do we care about Department of Education? Because Department of Education has data on 40 million American households. You needed a student loan or your kid needed a student loan. They've got your checking account, saving account, your asset sheet, who holds your mortgage, you know, what your mother wore at your wedding, all that stuff. and on 40 million Americans. That's pretty important data. We saw what happened with OPM. Sounds like a bureaucratic agency. Who cares whether OPM, Office of Personnel Management, was breached? Well, 24 million Americans did. But more importantly, if you had filed for a federal job, or if you had sought a security clearance, the keeper of those jewels was OPM. So whoever hacked into OPM, probably the Chinese, now has access to raw security clearance files on anyone who applied during that time period. What could go wrong with that? So, I mean, these are real issues. It's not the sexy, you know, we're never going to win, you know, Sexy Legislation of the Year awards. But to our way of thinking, this is one of the most foundational things we can do to improve the performance of government and better serve the people we represent. And it's not a partisan issue. It's not at all a partisan issue. It is a place where we can come together. And so that's what we're trying to do.
And with technology evolving so fast, what other legislation is needed if we look beyond cybersecurity? What are some other issues in federal IT you would personally like to address?
Well, I'd like to revel in the success of Vitara and just wait for all the awards to come in. There are specific issues like FedRAMP. We want to encourage the federal government to move more to the cloud, to partner more often with the private sector for its domain expertise. The mechanism for accelerating certification for that is FedRAMP. And unfortunately, maybe predictably, FedRAMP hasn't turned out the way we wanted it to. And so instead of being a 6-month low-cost, you know, maybe $250,000 cost for you to go through that process, many companies are finding it a 2 to 3 year process and in the millions. Well, that is exactly the opposite of what we wanted. And, you know, we've got to clean that up. And that may, you know, generally a legislative fix becomes very prescriptive, and you know, Congress doesn't do nuance and subtlety well. And so we can do that, but it will become a rigid framework, right? Somebody will interpret it and decide, yes, we're required to do that, and no, we're not. Well, we want to give more flexibility. We want to try to work out the problem rather than make a point. So we are prepared, and I certainly am prepared, to introduce legislation to address FedRAMP if we become convinced that the executive branch can't fix it. So that's one area. There are lots of other areas we're going to have to look at. You know, there's a conflict between, for some agencies, when you go for that cloud certification, and meanwhile you're trying to stay in compliance with FISMA. So we may have to look at those conflicts. I think they're unintended conflicts, but we don't want to put anyone in the position of violating FISMA while qualifying for providing cloud services. So we want to look at that. And we're going to continue to scorecard Vitara performance. We're going to continue to try to refine the scorecard so that it's fairer and gets a better picture of performance. And we're going to try to work with this White House, when they get around to appointing somebody we can talk to about the these kinds of issues.
And I know that today we have congressional committees and groups focused on artificial intelligence, IoT. Are you involved in any IoT or AI efforts? Or more emerging technologies?
Yeah, sort of peripherally. I mean, ours has been more, our lane has been more sort of how do we improve federal government performance directly.
The unsexy legislation.
Yeah. But I think we will broaden our scope once we finish this legislative round.
Okay, I think we have a couple of minutes to take questions, and then Congressman has to leave. Steve?
Congressman, you mentioned that there's no federal CIO, no federal chief technology officer, no federal CISO. Can you give some insight? Are there discussions going on to appoint these people, or is it just not even a topic of discussion, either on the Hill or at the White House?
Or the other CIO vacancies throughout government?
Or the CIO.
This is my second time around in Congress. My first was as a Senate committee staffer in the 80s during Ronald Reagan's administration. And I would say of all the administrations I've dealt with, the most professional, I mean on top of it, checking in with you twice a day whether they need to or not, was the Reagan years. I mean, I heard from that administration in my duties in the Senate every day, twice a day, 10 times a day. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I was Democrat. That didn't matter. They were checking in. And they were, it was a fruitful relationship. We're 9 months into this administration. I have not had a single communication, phone, email, drop by, anything, about anything from this White House. Not a word.
Do you expect that to change? He doesn't even have to say anything.
There's a lot I expect to change, or at least hope to change.
High hopes, low expectations, in
Yeah,
other words.
maybe we could put it that way.
Let's take one more question that's not from Steve. Anyone? Alan Balutis.
Is this working?
1 second, Alan.
Check.
We have a former CIO here, right? Alan?
Thank you. I want to switch the topic just a little bit. The focus of today's session is on health IT. And some of the major obstacles in terms of the applications of technology to healthcare are not technological ones or acquisition ones. It's some of the regulations and legislation that precludes the government from reimbursing on telehealth, telemedicine, those kinds of things. It requires the face-to-face interaction. And I'm sure there are other areas where that's equally true. I know your lane has been focused on the kind of infrastructure, but if government is going and the nation are going to get the benefits of technology, do you see any chances in Congress, or what are the mechanisms in Congress to deal with these other obstacles that are outside the IT and acquisition realm?
Yeah, you raise a really good point, Alan, and we do. We really do need to sort of look at both Medicare and Medicaid and Veterans Administration, for that matter, reimbursement processes and bring them into the 21st century. We have to take cognizance of the fact that things have changed, and the old way of counting what you reimburse and how you reimburse really needs to kind of catch up. And you said some of it isn't technology, but some of it is. I mean, I'll give you a small example, right? So the other day I had to go see the orthopedic surgeon, and I had to fill out all this paperwork, even though the hospital, Todd's hospital, has all the information about me they need, right? They already have a fairly recent file on drugs I take and conditions I've had and do have and all that good stuff. But I filled it all out like I was a brand new person. The PT, the physical therapy place I had to go to yesterday, is on the same floor, same door They don't even have a separate office. Just instead of going right, you go left. I had to fill out all that paperwork as if 2 days later. I'm thinking, have you guys heard of, I don't know, technology? I mean, I thought we were moving to electronic record keeping and transfer, and it would have been so much more efficient to be able to simply say, we've already got all that. Let me just verify something, or so we're still not there yet. And technology can make us a lot more efficient. I can remember visiting an oncology center with Innova that is the opposite kind of story, where doctors who were kind of resistant to having to do this electronically instead of writing notes or whatever, all of a sudden they could see when they're dealing with a number of patients on chemo, they could look at protocols simultaneously. It was a lot less clunky, a lot more efficient. They could make subtle changes and improve performance simply because the data is immediately available to them on multiple fronts. And so they were singing the praises of, what technology can do for better provision of medicine. So I think it's still a new frontier. I think, there are some medical institutions that are doing better than others. But I think the good news is maybe there's a lot of room for productivity gains in this regard. But the federal government has to take the lead instead of being sort of a laggard in recognizing what the new environment has done in terms of services and what it's going to reward by way of reimbursement. And we're nowhere near there yet.
I know you have a hard stop at 9:10, so you got to get to your appointment.
I'm going to PT.
I didn't want to say anything, but yeah. Congressman, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
We want to give you this small gift. It's a coffee cup, so it definitely meets the gift rules for that. So, GovernmentCIO Magazine coffee cup. You'll be the first one who gets one. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Yeah. Can you turn my mic off? Yeah, okay, cool.
With their strategy. So it may even be beyond IT. Strategy relative to compliance. Thank you. Strategy relative to whatever the agency may want to do. So thanks for being here, Mark. And let's see, I think we are now setting up for our next presentation. And I'll, again, hand it over to my colleague, Camille.
Thank you. I don't need the mic. I think we got everyone mic'd up, right? Okay, great. So, Debbie? No? She's not? Okay, all right. Okay, great. So we got everyone here. Let me just scoot over a little bit. So, okay, so we have Todd Simpson and Beth Kelleran. Todd is the CIO of FDA, and Beth is the CIO of HHS. So I want to really dive into it quickly. So over the past few years, we've seen some evolving citizen needs, advancements in technology, new legislation has changed how the federal government implements health IT. And agencies have heavily invested in health IT adoption and digital information with an eye towards innovation and emerging technologies. I'd like you to kind of set the stage and describe briefly how your role is helping that happens. So Todd?
We'll let Todd go first,
Um,
because he's on the front line.
well, I guess the simple answer is my role is to enable the business at the FDA, and it's a tricky business, but that's why I'm there, and everything that I do is intended to keep those missions in the centers moving forward. So we have a strategic plan, and we walk that path very diligently. We've executed about 50% on the plan since its inception in October of 2015. And we reevaluated the plan and updated it to account for changing mandates with the new administration and just all the new technologies that were available. And I think that the trick is really making sure that you listen to your customers and you have active engagement and you're aligning your technology and your business processes. And that's how I do it.
And you and I talked a little bit prior, and you said, we are keeping the lights on, we are working on cybersecurity, and it sounds like you're kind of doing the behind the scenes, not so sexy work when it comes to
Yeah, I mean, so at the
IT.
departmental level, so the operating divisions within Health and Human Services are really kind of doing the great new innovative technology, because they're on the front line and they have the problems to solve. But I always consider myself as the road work behind the scenes, because if you don't have the right infrastructure, you don't have the right byways and intersections, it doesn't matter what kind of great tech you have out there, it's going to be very siloed and be ineffective. One of our organizations this year, as we were working on 1722, talked about that the department is data rich and information poor. That means that we've got tons of data, but it's not integrated, and there's no way to be able to really solve and work on particular health crises or particular human services areas because it's so siloed. Some of the reasons for that are the aging legacy infrastructure and the legacy systems that we have. So my job is to bring us up to par with industry so that we can then do plug and play with the operating divisions to do that great new tech.
And Todd, you and I talked about this before, that your agency or FDA has really implemented cloud to a large part. So FDA was the first agency to use a cloud brokerage model to drive standards. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, sure. So we built a trusted cloud platform. It's our cloud brokerage model. I'm very proud of it. I've talked about it at different venues, but it continues to mature. And we're at a point now where we're actually doing this cloud roadshow. We're going across the FDA, making sure that we get exposure to all of our customers. Again, it's a federated environment, so sometimes our customers will look to us for the shared services, and we just need to make sure that they're aware of what those shared services really are, and that's really the intent of that cloud roadshow. But basically, we showcase our cloud portal, the tools that we've built to make it easy to navigate the cloud. We have a decision tree, a calculator that allows our customers to estimate what they're going to be charged to spin up an environment. And in that cloud brokerage model, we have now 6 different cloud service providers providing infrastructure, software, and platform as a service. So we've covered all our bases. And again, we continue to mature it, and we're just trying to make sure that we fill in all the gaps in the model and make it as user-friendly as possible. And of course, that doesn't say that there's an end to on-premise, because that one of the tools is that decision tree, which allows our customers to say, well, what is the best combination of resources that I should put together to make this happen? What's the safest way to proceed, or the quickest way to proceed, or the most least cost path? So we're pretty proud of that. And I don't know if we're the only cloud brokerage model in the federal government, but I think that we're maturing at a very rapid rate. And I want to give that cloud brokerage model to Beth through some kind of an IIA, so it can be leveraged and the other optives don't have to repeat the work that we've done.
So while Todd's doing kind of a cloud brokerage internally, NIH is actually doing a cloud brokerage with educational organizations, because obviously within NIH they have a great deal of research data. But this is becoming very large, very complex. No longer can any institute or university store all of the information, and trying to move it even across their very fast research network, internet too, is becoming difficult. So they've actually been working on a brokerage model with some of the big cloud providers that we can actually authorize vouchers to universities to get in moving their data to the same cloud through a brokerage model. So we're working on both internal and external cloud brokerage within the department.
And you mentioned to me that one of the biggest challenges within your department is legacy systems. So how are you approaching those?
So we're looking at the totality of our legacy systems, and so we first had to look at something that's called high-value assets. It's a pretty common term now within the federal sector, which these are the programs that are most critical to running the government and running agencies. So things that have direct interface with citizens or direct capability to making sure that there's a continuity of operations across the federal government. Internally to HHS, we have a little under 100 systems, of which, of those high-value assets, 57 we've determined are the most critical. So we're working on replacing those or modernizing those systems first. My organization has made sure that we've done analysis. We've let all of the operating divisions know where those particular systems are and what technology is past end of life, which means it's no longer supported by the vendor. For me, it's not, is it a operating system, because you can keep patching it, you can keep making sure that the updates are there. These are truly systems that are past that. That means that the vendor no longer supports it, or you're going to pay a substantial amount of money extra in order to get the support. And now we're also working on, so we're having the operating divisions do those plans, and then in addition, there's 2 or 3 technologies, you can probably understand what those are. So we're actually working directly with the vendors that are providing those. So for example, I heard one of them was giving FDA a plan. I said, no, we can't do it at an FDA and an NIH and a CDC. I want the HHS plan. So you tell me how you're going to fix the department and all of these systems, not just one organization. And so we're trying to work on it at a 2-factor, one at the organizational level and one at the vendor level.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to you. You talked about cloud, which is pretty much mainstream technology these days. I know you mentioned AI and you've mentioned machine learning. What are some of the work you're doing with those technologies there?
Well, if I could just mention about the legacy systems. So I talk about the execution of the strategic plan, and I talk about what we've invested in our cloud infrastructure. And it really all comes back to the legacy systems and this interoperability first mantra that I'm adopting at FDA. Because interoperability, system duplication, and data are 3 biggest challenges at the FDA. That's, I've said it for the 30 months that I've held this position. And so trying to solve that interoperability nightmare, if you will, it goes out, it goes in, it's not just internal to FDA. We have to talk to other agencies. But just that interoperability when you're dealing with legacy systems like that, we're investing in the cloud, not only so we can move toward this DevOps pipeline where we have microservices and Agile Development, but all of that cloud work is just foundational. And I think what we really need to do is kind of bring a little bit more order to the way we do our development, the way that we manage our business, and really leverage the cloud and build a pathway to migrate our legacy systems and to do new development. And I think it can all be done. I know it can all be done in one model, but that's kind of where we're bringing everything together. Now, to answer your question about AI and the innovation side of the house, we have an innovation lab, and as part of my, I would say my workforce optimization initiative that I've just kicked off, it's an official project. I'm realigning everything in my organization. And I previously had innovation separated from my CTO's shop, and I did that for a reason, because I dedicated my CTO to doing some infrastructure stabilization, at the right personality at the right time, everything lined up. But we're a little bit beyond that now at the FDA, and so I want to bring the innovation back into the CTO shop and focus on the innovation piece and the EA piece and really flesh out the governance model a little bit. And inside the innovation realm, we've brought lots of different technologies. It's hard to talk about the technologies in an agnostic manner, but there are several technologies that we're looking at that are complementing one another, and we're finding the use cases across the FDA. And I've actually taken a kind of a different approach. In previous roles, I was slow to put vendors right in front of my customers because it was like this opportunity where the vendor could sell. And the customer may say, wow, this is great. I want the leather interior and I want all the bells and whistles. And I'm not there to shepherd it. But the role is too big at the FDA. There were 22,000 users. It's federated. So I have to rely on my vendor partners to come in. So I look for strategic partnerships, ones that I can really trust, those contractors that aren't going to lift up the rug and sweep the dirt under it and drop the rug when I'm not looking. And it's really, really important. That's kind of a message to everybody because I need more of that strategic partnership, especially in the innovation front when it comes to things like AI, to get in front of these scientists that are much smarter than me, that are trying to solve problems that I can't even, get my small brain around. But I can get people in front of them that can actually come up with a solution, and then we can dilute it and we can run it through the paces of the innovation lab and put it into a proof of concept and a project and full implementation. Very long answer, but I'm trying to send a lot of information out to this community that maybe they can, use to penetrate the hard shell of the FDA if they want to do business. So.
I want to go back to what you said about Agile and DevOps. I mean, it's a big shift from the traditional waterfall approach. So how was that to kind of go through the process and embrace a more Agile approach?
Most of it is culture. And, it's really, we talk about waterfall, we talk about Agile, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but it really comes back to just being a good steward of the business and understanding what you have, knowing what systems are out there, taking that catalog, and then making sure that everything's ATO'd, making sure that the knowledge is transferred through, some kind of an idle knowledge transfer process to a help desk, that resources are being properly hosted in secure environments. At the end of the day, I think it's really a simple thing to manage the business like you care about the business and not to be in this reactive mode. And I'm kind of talking about the federal workforce a little bit. These are challenges. I've heard this saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I live that every day at the FDA because we have a strategy, but the culture is always ever present. It's like working against it. This is the way that we do it here at this agency, and I've heard that every agency I've went to. We're not like the private sector. We can't run government like a business. You can actually get closer to that. It's just bringing in good stewardship, I think. So that being said, once you have that, okay, so maybe there's a couple different ways to look at how you do your development. It's very common in the federal government for teams to be built around systems. And that's something I think that perpetuates that legacy application model, that, where you have those monolithic applications that are around for 20, 30 years, because you're building a team and you're hiring a bunch of feds that are going to be here possibly for 30 years. So they have no vested interest to change the technology, because then they would have to change, and that's not human nature. So you just have to accept kind of what we are and say, well, maybe there's a better way to do it, and maybe we can just move away from that team approach where everyone's dedicated to a system, and every time I build a new system, I have to build a new team. And maybe we build a pipeline, and we build environments where we have a production environment, a test environment, a dev environment, kind of like we did when we worked in the private sector. It's not rocket science, and this stuff has been around for 20, 30 years. As long as I've been in IT, and much smarter people than me showed me how to do this stuff. So I don't know any other real way to approach it other than to build that pipeline to leverage your matrix organization and use IDLE. Find a framework that you can apply. And if you find a framework, it's all about identifying roles and defining those lines of accountability. And your model has to have accountability. Without it, you can't execute.
And Beth, you're nodding. What is it that resonates with you?
Well, so I think FDA is actually a little bit of a lagger for Agile in our department. It's the one area that our department actually is achieving Vitara, so we actually have a B. in Agile Development, because we have making sure that we're doing things and really appreciating
Yes.
Todd's support and getting FDA to that same level. But I think one of the things that we have to do as a federal organization, which is, what is the things that we want to keep internal? And being able to understand the one area of business, I think, is what is our core business and what do we need to release because it's not our core business. And historically, the government has wanted to have everything be their core business. And when you're a jack of all trades, you can't be a specialist in any one of them. So we have to look at what can we do, how can we leverage cloud, how can we leverage other technology so that we can actually put those smart people back into the mission programs that are delivering capabilities that only the federal government can provide, as opposed to trying to spread our tiny little bit of dollars, in some cases, to try to do everything. Because I think that's where we're struggling. And then, when we keep building things and we have to keep carrying feed of all of them, and we all want to protect the thing that we built, there's no way to then try to bring all of those capabilities together because someone feels that they have either done something wrong or that their program is no longer viable or needed in an organization, when I think that we have to promote both from a budgetary perspective, which I think is another piece, because all the money goes into an individual program. It doesn't go to certain kinds of capabilities. If we can be able to promote and respect and actually make sure that we're championing where those things come down. One of the areas, for example, as I mentioned, is data. Well, if every single system has its own data with its own lexicon and its own way of managing that data, how do you ever bring data together to solve real-world problems? I mean, if we are going to try to, cure cancer or bring drugs to market quicker or fight the opioid crisis, right now we have opioid data in 5 different octaves in our organization. So, I mean, we're going to try to, our chief technology officer in a month or so is actually going to do a codathon to try to bring that data together. But if each organization says, no, it's mine, how do we solve a crisis as a group versus individuals? As we were doing our 1722 work, one of the things I think we all recognized, and I kind of talked about, which is many federal agencies do great jobs in crisis, right? So we're fighting, 3 hurricanes, and wildfires. We all come together during those times. We do a phenomenal job because that's where we come together. We take down all the silos. We just know that there's a problem in solving it. But as soon as those crises are gone, everybody goes right back into their lane and doesn't want to talk to anybody. So how do we flip the norm that says crisis mode, not wanting to have a crisis, but how we operate in crisis becomes the norm versus the other?
And both of you mentioned cybersecurity as a challenge and a focus area. Todd, you told me that we have a cybersecurity story to tell. Talk about that.
Oh, yeah, we have a great cybersecurity story to tell at the FDA because we had to go through a GAO audit at the hand of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and it was actually in play when I arrived in May of 2015. So we went through the audit, and they found a bunch of stuff, and it resulted in a report that had a kind of a scary title. It was a little misrepresentative, in my opinion.
What was the title?
Industry data is at risk, something like that. And there had been no breaches to qualify that. There had never been any compromised data. So our systems, though, did have some audit findings, and 15 programmatic recommendations were made, and we actually resolved those programmatic recommendations in record time, and those are the words of the Energy and Commerce, or the Energy and Commerce Committee folks themselves, that we did in 45 days what other agencies took 18 months to do. So we were very proud of that, and Beth was talking about high-valued assets before. We have 16 HVAs, and we put together a program as a result of one of the programmatic recommendations of the GAO audit to manage our high-value assets, and it was just recently picked up by OMB in the White House as a best practice for the federal government. So the work that we're doing in that cyber program is being recognized. We stood up a systems management center, which was a combined NOC and SOC, and we won a CISO 2017 award for that work. But more importantly, the results are really in the operations. I think we've reduced our mean time of outages by over 60%. our response rate is just it's incredible because the work actually starts before the ticket's even opened, and the ticket gets opened and everything gets logged. But there's this actionable approach, and so our cybersecurity story continues to be told because we're now of course implementing CDM and all those technologies that comprise CDM. And we're pushing, I think, the bounds of CDM because of our cloud brokerage model, in that, I think when CDM was first kind of thought up, there was a cloud-first initiative, but I don't think the two were really aligned as closely as they needed to be. And I don't think it was anyone's fault as much as it was just available technology. You don't know what you don't know. But now we know we have to watch the data that's moving between the cloud and the on-premise facilities. And CDM, there are technologies that have come on the market since. So we're now looking at implementing those technologies and moving forward. And I hope to serve as an example for other agencies that start to get to that state. So just back on the comment, we are experts at reacting in the federal government. And that was kind of the culture eating strategy point. Beth really made it much more eloquently than I did. We're always reacting, and we're really good at it. But if we could, and I hate to use the trendy word of being proactive, but getting ahead of that stuff through just understanding the business and building the funnels that any problem can go in, and thinking out what those problems are, and doing better continuity planning, succession planning, and all the things that go into managing a business from a more holistic standpoint, instead of just being good in emergencies, which we are. We're amazing in emergencies. So.
Beth, do you want to talk a little bit about cyber?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a question. So I'm going to do a poll for the people here in this room. So by a show of hands, how many people in this room either currently have or know someone that either has Medicare, CAID, CHIP, or the Affordable Care Act insurance? Raise hands. That's about 3/4 of this room. We have your data. We have your data. If that doesn't say that we need to make cybersecurity our #1 priority, I don't know what it is. And as the culture of the breach organizations, the people that want that data, is shifting from credit cards and social security numbers to whether you have a pacemaker, whether you have some sort of maybe mental health that you don't want to have out, that makes it that much more important for us to protect your data, because your data is about you. It is not for someone next to you to know unless you personally want to share it. It should not be used against you, and it should not be in the hands of people that would want to do something with that. And because of that shift, our #1 thing is to protect the American citizens and their data. Just by the show of hands in here, we actually know that we have at least 1 in 3 Americans' personal identifiable information. And that's in addition to the fact that we have your health data. You put those two pieces of information together, we probably know more about everybody around the country than most organizations have, which make us a primary target. And then you add on top of that, we have information about drugs that might be coming to market, or medical devices that are coming to market, or research that's being done at NIH. That makes it an even larger target. I love that FDA has the statistic that they have over 500 million breach attempts a week. A week, and that's just one operating division. You can imagine how many we have to fend off on a given week. And so if you look at that and then you look at how much we're spending on cyber, it's just monumental what our staff is being able to do. So on average, they want you to spend about 6 to 8% on cyber of your total IT budget. We're spending about 3 or 4. And with that, being able to do incredible things and being able to fight off these very sophisticated hack and breach attempts without having compromise of data. And that's in addition to making sure that we are doing the things that we need to do around CDM and Einstein. We get what we need to do from a federal perspective, But what I think we need to think about in cyber is not here's a mandate we need to make to it, or here's an audit and we need to close that in a reactive mode. We need to get into a risk management model. So we really have in the department looked at what we have as our threats, what is our risk, and it's actually very enlightening to me if we actually had our business come in and do an enterprise risk. It wasn't the technologist, it wasn't the HR directors, the business came in. And I bet you can, if I told you the top 3 risks in our department, you wouldn't be at all surprised. Number 1 is cyber, number 2 is human capital, and number 3 is legacy systems. That is what the business determined. And so if number 1 is cyber, we better make sure that we're working on it, because we understand that those high value assets can be taken down by being an old system or by being breached. And in many cases, they go hand in hand. And so we have to make sure that we're building in capabilities of protection. It's not mission or protection, it's mission with protection. Because if you don't, it won't be there. Industry has had this type of concept for a long time, but it's usually called quality control or quality assurance. Right? You need to make sure that your products don't have defects. Well, think of a ability to hack into it. A vulnerability is a quality assurance problem. Mm-hmm. And so how do we make sure in both industry and in the public sector that we don't have any of those quality assurance problems?
And one of the questions I asked you, Todd, prior to this event was, how has your role as CIO evolved over the years? And you said, there was no chief data officer a few years back, there was no innovation lab. Mm-hmm. What else have you encountered that didn't exist a few years back that you have now?
Those were the big ones. I mean, data was not like this focus area when I started. It was really, IT was just really easy, but I started as an engineer too, studying for Microsoft certifications and CCNAs and things like that. It was all about technology. So maybe the data was always there and we just didn't know it, I don't know. But definitely this emphasis on, data standards, this kind of acknowledgement of the necessity to have a framework, that you rely on. I think you can bring experience and know-how to any problem, but you should always try to find a framework like we did, IDLE or NIST, in the President's executive order that he just released in March. He asked all the federal agencies to comply with NIST, and we at HHS were kind of ahead of that. We have a NIST framework, and we're mapping our technologies to align with that. So I don't know if it's net new areas like governance and data, or if it's just refining or getting deeper. And I don't know if it's always been there, or if it's just because I'm learning more. But man, so many follow-ups from the stuff that Beth had to say. I just want to chime in. At the FDA alone, one of the findings was that we weren't spending enough money on cyber, so we went from 3% to 8%. Meanwhile, we've decreased our budget by about 9.5% since I've been there, and I've watched the user population at FDA grow by about 20%. And meanwhile, we've executed the 55% on that strategic plan. And all of that is just really because of a different mindset. Because instead of just waiting for something to smack you in the face, going out and kind of just elaborating on the thoughts that Beth has kind of sparked for me, getting out there, understanding what you have, caring for it like you would if it meant something to you. And just having holistic management of it and saying, what if something happens, or what can I do to make this better? And and I think that some of that is taking place even with our legacy applications. And we just had this the deeming, the vape shops all registered through our federal through our listing application. It's a legacy application. It's a very old application. But we enabled that through care and maintenance, through heavy investments in O&M, and development to make it bigger, better, and usable, even though it's kind of outdated.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't mean to take us back in the questions.
No,
It's
it's
just
fine.
she said so many interesting things I could probably talk for an hour about.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions. So, one question before Mike yells at me.
Sorry.
He has a mic here.
Does anyone have any questions for CIOs?
Where are the reporters?
Yeah, this is
Tom
Tom
Suter.
Suter. I have a question for Todd. A little bit more detail about, managing these legacy systems, putting things in the clouds. Do you have like an API gateway? How do you have that in place yet, or? Because another agency was just asking me about this the other day.
Yeah, so,
So, I was going to say, now you've hit the thing that's my big hit for 2018.
so why don't you?
So my big hit for 2018 is a microservices departmental gateway legacy new version of a service bus for all of our management systems. It's my hit for this year.
Internal to FDA, obviously the APIs are a big deal to get the interoperability, that I identified as one of our 3 major challenges. So we've actually identified a cloud service provider that we're looking at partnering with to provide that support. And we've got a few other ideas, but there's a whole roadmap for that in our microservices.
Right, so we're going to kind of leverage some of the capability that FDA has done around microservices, and then I already have commitments from at least 2 of the 3 line of business in the management suite to do that across the department. So that'll be a big, huge thing, because right now, for example, some of our systems have over 100 different interfaces alone, and then if you do that on a multiple system-to-system basis, point-to-point, you can imagine the complexity and costs associated.
Okay, I think that's all we had time for. Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Beth.
Yep.
We're going to give you this GovernmentCIO magazine coffee cup, so do not leave before that. Can you take these two? Okay. Okay, so we have a little bit of a change of in plans. Debbie Bucci, who's the blockchain evangelist, is her unofficial title at HHS. She was on a plane, and I'm guessing you were a little bit delayed. So instead of having her on the panel, I want to do a one-on-one and talk about blockchain.
Okay.
So let me see. So you are a blockchain evangelist at HHS. Talk a little bit about exactly what you do there in your role.
So I am an IT architect in the Office of the National Coordinator. I'm a techie in a policy shop, essentially. But my focus is really on privacy and security, and because I was like 15, 20 years at NIH, I look towards emerging technology. And with a focus, I did a lot of SOA infrastructure, federated authentication. So I have a real sense of that's my interest for that.
And blockchain is all the rage now. What has led up to this momentum that we see?
So I've been following it for at least 3 or 4 years. I first heard about it at MIT when some of the Bitcoin folks had gone to talk about the underlying technology around blockchain. And what caught my interest early was the crypto folks were really leaning in heavily around the distributed nature of information and data. And there's a lot of hype around the promise, but what it seems, what we've been told is auditing, non-repudiation, ways to share legal documentation digitally, and things like that. So there's a move to a parallel move to the Bitcoin monetary around that type of information.
What do you see as, what is the federal government's adoption of blockchain? It's relatively new to the federal sector. Where do you see, have you come across any interesting use cases?
I don't believe blockchain is not ready for full-fledged adoption, but there are places, GSA, DHS, that are taking really hard looks at it. There have been some SBIR grants that are specifically looking at blockchain around identity management, and we have done a couple of exploratory challenges around just to get a sense of how it could potentially be used.
I know you've planned hackathons around the topic, and what were some of the key takeaways from that?
Blockchain is a class of distributed ledger technologies. There's not just one. Coming from the Office of the National Coordinator, interoperability is huge. So there is a lot of focus around how to get these different chains to interop. Not only that, what are the services that it relies on at the hackathon itself. Half of them used a distributed web. IPFS is kind of a distributed World Wide Web type of application. And that was down, and because of that, half of them couldn't even do their demonstrations. So I think the takeaway there is it's not just the distributed technology, but what are the other standards and protocols that are going to be needed to support this type of infrastructure.
What are some of the misconceptions you've heard about blockchain? What are some common ones that you encounter?
Blockchain will rip and replace everything that's there. There is a school of thought. You should never, ever, ever, ever put PI information on the blockchain, because even though it's encrypted, keys expire. Private keys get stolen. So, but it is a way to have pointers to data, as they're saying, off-chain.
What do you think that agencies who are looking to kind of dip their toes into blockchain and start exploring the technologies, what are some of the strategic things that they should do first?
So my sense is that they are focusing on the low-hanging fruit of what are the challenges that they are having now instead of replacing what is there. So for an example, there was a demonstration done out of Boston around health records, around the auditing and the metadata, the extra information about blockchain, about the medical records, and they found that actually streamlined their processes. The interesting thing is they weren't necessarily tied to a specific blockchain, but the idea that they had this public ledger of being able to track the information. So there are supply chains, ways of about ledger auditing that I do believe that I see that some of the agencies are possibly taking a look at.
Mm-hmm. And we're very early in the kind of nascent stages of
very
adoption.
Very early.
What's your vision of blockchain? Like, where would you see it, or where do you see it used in the next few years or so, 3 to 5 years?
So it just came from the West Coast from an identity workshop, and my focus is, I don't know if you've heard of the term of sovereign identity. What is sovereign identity? And then for those of the whole idea of having aggregated claims about, to be able to do a claim that you're over 21 or something like that. So I think it's too early for a strategy to see where it's going, but it seems there are emerging standards around uniquely identifying the chains, how to uniquely identify verified claims and things like that. That I think has the potential of moving the whole blockchain effort forward to give it some interoperability framework to hang from, so to speak.
And what are you most excited about blockchain that you're working on? What's next for you?
Not working on anything directly, though. We just had a challenge that we issued a few months ago around auditing. We did not indicate blockchain about it at all. But the interesting thing is the top 3 out of the 4 finalists were blockchain potential solutions. No matter how we diced it or sliced it, it was at least half of them were with blockchain. So it'd be interesting using Hyperledger, Fabric, one of them using Ethereum. So I'm really kind of excited to see what potential solutions they're coming up for the challenge, just to see how things have moved forward.
I have some more questions, but I want to make sure that I take a couple of questions from the audience as well. Do we have questions?
No questions, good.
No? Steve?
I do have a question. I mean, it must be challenging to. Thank you, Mike. It must be challenging to work on a technology in government that is so cutting edge that probably a lot of people don't understand it, can probably, can't get their arms around how they can apply it. How do you deal with that? How do you try to explain a technology and its potential when so few people, even in society, forget government, just don't really even understand it?
So about a year and a half ago, I went to ONC and I said, there's something going on with blockchain and we really need to look at it. And, the mission, that certainly doesn't align with what the mission is, but because of the hype, we realized that it was something that we could not ignore. So at that time, I did a query on Google to see healthcare and blockchain, and I could only find 3 references. One was Estonia, MIT that I was familiar with, and then there was Philips Healthcare. So we did a challenge for white papers to align it with NIST. We also talked to NIST, and NIST was the same. It's like, we don't know whether we should do anything yet. Should we watch it? So we figured that it would be a good way to start would be to have a workshop to what is blockchain, how does it use it, and use the papers to kind of drive the agenda. We expected 15 papers, we got 77. And what happened is so what's happening is, so we used that as a level setting a year ago. If you go to healthit.gov/blockchain, many of the papers that are there, the ones that aren't there, were actually gone to publication elsewhere. The workshop is there. So we did a base level of understanding of what blockchain was then. But that understanding then from now is it's still evolving. So as agencies, I believe we need to lean in, to watch how it progresses. But as far as I am aware of, I do not know of anything outside of pilot or demonstrations. There was an example, a really interesting one, the state of Illinois that is using blockchain for the issuing of credentials, licensing, and possibly for cross-state. But because of the limitations and nobody's going to put information on the blockchain yet, they're having to do manual like forms, or have the physicians actually certify that these are their registration shortcuts. So it's way, way too early, but there's attempts.
Do you have peers in other federal agencies do other federal agencies have a blockchain advocate like you?
Yes, there are other advocates.
There's a group of you guys.
Yeah, well, we had a GSA that was here. Certainly there's been a tremendous lot of work done in DHS around the identity, and they are very adamant about not putting any PII on the blockchain. And so I was like, isn't it time to get some white papers out there that to really from the lessons learned, but also to talk to the community that's actually working in the identity space and how they're working with Hyperledger, the Indy project, to see how that is really shaping up and how their thought process has gone over I just came from there, so that's why I'm kind of excited about that. To see that progress, it's maybe not ready to reveal to agencies, but there is a framework that I sense there's a framework that's becoming that we'll be realizing within the next, I don't know, 6, 8 months, I don't know, but it's there.
Is there better awareness or more awareness among private sector folks when it comes to blockchain?
I think because of financial and Bitcoin and all that, there is an awareness of the underlying technology of that. I think that's possibly driving a lot of the hype and the popularity around it, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Questions back there?
Uh-oh.
Certainly part of the success of electronic health records is due to ONC's efforts to create a framework around certification and standards. Do you envision that ONC could play a role in the security aspects of that? It could be argued, whether it's blockchain or some other solution.
Oh, I don't want to speculate about that.
Oh. But it would certainly be helpful to those of us concerned about the ability to take 1 or 2 data fields at a time from 25 sites to put your electronic health profile together.
So isn't there a school of thought of if blockchain is a technology, is an underlying technology like database technology, I don't know that we certified databases. It could be that it's a standard or protocol that may mature on their own, that maybe it's too early to tell if it even needs any type of certification. That's where I say I wouldn't want to speculate it, because it seems that blockchain is an underlying technology that I don't think the average Joe, the average citizen, will know they're using blockchain, but the idea that they quickly have access to their information, I do know that I've seen some examples when people start talking about blockchain, they hold up their phone and here's all the information that's there. It'll be so, what is it, the word I'm looking for, ubiquitous, that you would possibly, it doesn't make sense, I don't think.
Like cloud. I mean, nobody, we all use cloud, but what do we talk about it? Not really. So
Say it again?
Cloud is the same. It's not visible. I mean, we just
It's not
use
visible.
it. Yeah.
The closest is FedRAMP, right? There's certification, that kind of thing, but.
Right. I think we have one more question. Frankie over there? Yes. Oh, Toby
Yes,
Jones.
sorry, just to follow up on the discussion. In talking about FedRAMP and its application to data, the security aspects of it indeed do drive a lot of stuff and a lot of standardization, a lot of requirements imposed on your databases, your access to it, how do you prevent people from hacking into it and all of that sort of stuff. And so I think one of the questions is it conceivable that blockchain is going to become somehow standard and interchangeable, or is it driving towards proprietary solutions, like many of the other things are, like databases used to be, that force us as a government to enter in some large and long-term and rather painful relationships with vendors? So do you have an idea of where the technology kind of leans to on that sort of a spectrum between openness and standardization or proprietary solutions?
Is there a question there, Tony?
Yeah,
Can you summarize
David
it?
Or, well,
In which direction do you think blockchain is going?
So, my sense is both, that there will be distributed ledger technology, there are many, many flavors. And for the openness of the market, a lot of the work is how do you translate, as a matter, I saw one app, how do you translate one blockchain from another to get some generic, perhaps there's standardization around semantics. I mean, that happens with all different technologies, right? Semantic standardizations. When you began to talk, I was thinking about the security of pairwise relationships with keys. There's still going to be a key management issue that you're going to have to manage how to lost keys, expired keys, and things like that. That is going to be a tremendous, that needs to be focused, and I would think needs to be standardized around that type of work. But I'm not. Hopefully, it's more open. But you would think there would be some proprietary ways of doing the distributed ledger. If that's going to happen, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Debbie. I would love to catch up. No, it's okay. I would love to catch up with you maybe in 12 months and see.
You'd be interested.
See how this whole conversation about blockchain has evolved. So thank you so much for taking the time. Here's a little coffee cup. So there you go. Thank you. Okay, you're right behind me. Great. I don't even have to change my chair. Okay, let's make sure. All right, it's getting a little hot in here with all the action going on. Maybe it's the lights too, and the sunny weather, of course. So, Todd Stoudemire is the CEO of Innova Center for Personal Health. So, give us the elevator pitch. What exactly does the center do?
So the Innova Center for Personalized Health is part of the Innova Health System, and it's really an inside-out disruptor. We have this 117-acre campus, formerly the headquarters for ExxonMobil, and the whole focus is on personalized health, and that's different from precision medicine, because fundamentally what we're trying to do, how do we keep healthy people healthy in the first place? How can we better predict and prevent disease? And if you get disease, understand the molecular biology of the disease so we can treat it with a very targeted therapeutic. So it's different when you think about the healthcare system today, which is really a sick system. That's what we do now. We treat sick people. And this is really how do we keep healthy people healthy in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Some of the conversations I've had with health IT leaders point to a future where it's more about treating the patient at home rather than filling hospital beds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I was with the healthcare system for a couple of years, went back into the technology space, but I had a futurist who worked for me, and this is 2009, he drew this great picture. He said the healthcare system of the past, at the center was the hospital, and then you had spokes. He said the healthcare system of the future, at the center is information, and the hospital is just one of those spokes because more and more care is being done in what we call ambulatory settings outside the hospital, or it's being done in the home. So there is a real transition that's going place and very different thinking about what is the healthcare system of the future, particularly with data and information coming from so many sources outside of the healthcare system.
So what will be the biggest difference between the healthcare system, the yesterday's healthcare system as opposed to the future one?
Well, I think, again, a couple things. One, focus on health versus sick. And again, people are still going to get sick, unfortunately, but that reorientation about how do we keep healthy people healthy in the first place. And then secondly, again, more and more being done outside of the healthcare system. We've gone through in healthcare, the first big thing was around digitization of records, electronic medical records, and centralization of data, standardization of protocols and processes. That's just making the pipes work both inside the healthcare system and the interoperability with data outside of the healthcare system, because that was kind of the first big thing. The second thing now is really the proliferation of data. And it's both the types of data, phenotypic data, genotypic data, sociodemographic data, data that's coming from lots of different sources, and also where that data is coming from, because it's not just coming from inside a healthcare system. It's data that comes from outside the healthcare system. It could come from devices, it could wearables and and those types of, the Internet of Things, generating very important data that can be actionable when brought together with other data to make that actionable information.
Where do you see the largest growth when it comes to investing in emerging technologies?
I think there's, I'll talk two ways. I think there's diagnostics, gene technology, gene sequencing, gene editing, which is obviously a fairly controversial subject today with CRISPR technology, targeted therapeutics, something very important. How do we, again, understand the molecular biology of disease, and how do we target that disease so we treat you as an individual, not as a population class? The virtualization of health. Alan had a good question earlier. One of the challenges we face today is that the science and technology is running much, much faster than the ecosystem, the public policy ecosystem, the payment ecosystem. We have basically 50 systems of virtualized health. I sit on a virtual health company board, so I think that's a big opportunity as well.
Is that one of the reasons you guys decided to launch an accelerator as well?
So we launched something called the Innova Personalized Health Accelerator, really a kind of a three-part effort. First, we have a free education initiative around entrepreneurship, really trying to increase entrepreneurship in the health sector. Secondly, we did launch an accelerator. And again, how do we increase the innovation quotient inside the health system by taking nascent and other types of technologies and then applying those inside the health system? And the third thing we did, we created a venture fund. We actually created a $150 million venture fund to invest in technologies, again, around adoption inside the healthcare system. So we're very much trying to drive innovation inside the healthcare system, a lot of intellectual property is created, as you can imagine, inside the healthcare system, and then be much more intentional about how we interact externally. Healthcare as an industry, and some of you are in healthcare, has not been particularly good at looking at other industries and how we can adopt things that are being done in other industries inside healthcare. So again, we're really trying to increase the internal innovation quotient and make us much more externally aware of technologies that could be applied internally inside the healthcare system.
Could you maybe mention some of the initiatives that have come out of the accelerator? What are they focusing on?
Well, we just launched the accelerator. We launched the venture fund about a year ago. So we've made a number of investments in devices, particularly we're going first in human type trials, and a lot in analytics. One of the emerging technologies that are probably to mention, we are very, very focused on predictive analytics. How can we predict sepsis? How can we predict who's likely to readmit? How can we predict who may be more likely to fall? Because those are big issues. How can we better engage with those who've been inside the healthcare system, go outside the healthcare system? How do we make sure that the medication adherence and diet, which has a big impact on health? So, predictive analytics is an area where we've made a lot of investment, and I think we'll continue to make investment both internally and also with external partners.
What has been some of the key takeaways in adopting that kind of technology?
In terms of predictive analytics? I think we're still very early. Healthcare is an industry, and this is me editorializing, but I think we were late to the game in terms of really adopting information technology. With meaningful use, the big push around electronic medical records, electronic health records, and really that's just to make basic data workflow move within the healthcare system. I think one of the big challenges is that so much important data, as I mentioned earlier, is coming from outside the healthcare system. So how do we take data from various sources and bring that together and turn it into actionable information that can improve clinical outcomes, quality, safety, the patient experience? We're still in the very early innings. I like baseball. I'm a Yankees fan, so I apologize for anybody who doesn't like the Yankees. But we're still playing, by the way. And we're still in the very early innings of this because we were late around the adoption of information technology. We're still working out. We like to joke. We implemented Epic, that Epic's a four-letter word, both literally and figuratively. And if you've implemented Epic, you would understand our pain. Good system, tough system, not an easy system to implement. But we're still very early in the, I think, the adoption of information technology. We're very early, I think, in how do we take, and I don't like the term big data because I think data is interesting, but it's not relevant unless you can turn it into actionable information. So how do we take phenotypic data, genotypic data, data outside the healthcare system? The holy grail for us is kind of that longitudinal look at a person's health, not sickness, but a person's health. How can we better predict and prevent disease? And again, if you get disease, how can we make sure we target your specific disease based on what you have as an individual? Another exciting area for us is what we call the area of pharmacogenomics, which is the intersection of pharmacology and genomics, and the ability through a sequence, just to take a sequence right here, cheek sequence, and run a sequence on you, we can come back and we can tell you how you will metabolize certain drugs, and so dosing levels and toxicity, because we don't want to give you a drug if it doesn't work, and we certainly don't want to give you a drug if it has high levels of toxicity. Again, one of the questions earlier about the ecosystem having to catch up with the science and technology, a lot of those tests that have high evidence, high efficacy, certainty, if you will, around drug metabolism and toxicity, they're not reimbursed today. So I'll give you a real life example. Somebody had his knee replaced down in Florida, and he spent several days, additional days in the hospital.
Is that Congressman Connolly?
No, it's not. And we never identify the person. But he had knee replacement surgery, and he ended up bleeding. And this was not in our health system, but bleeding profusely. And it took a lot of work, and he spent 3 or 4 extra days in the hospital. He's fine, thank goodness. But he came back north and had our pharmacogenomics test. One of the drugs in that panel is Coumadin, warfarin, which is a blood thinner. And it showed that he should never get warfarin. Now that $400 test today is not reimbursed. Now if he'd had that $400 test before he had his knee surgery, they would have never allowed him to be on Coumadin or warfarin because they knew it had such an adverse effect today. Now his time spent in the hospital cost tens of thousands of additional dollars. Today that was reimbursed by Medicare because he's over 65. But that $400 test is not reimbursed today, even though there's absolute clear scientific evidence that we can tell you that he should never have been on Coumadin or warfarin in the first place. So the ecosystem has to catch up to where the science and technology are today, and more importantly, where it's going tomorrow.
What are some of the technologies that you personally think have been most disruptive in changing the healthcare sector?
Well, I'll give a big shout out. I was recently with Dr. Eric Green, who runs the NIH National Human Genome Research Institute, and as you know, around 1990, we started this remarkable project called the Human Genome Research Project to see if we could map the human genome. It took 13 years, and we mapped the human genome, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not we should invest in basic science and research as a country and government, and I'm a big proponent for that because we spent about $3 billion to map the first human genome. So how much does it cost today to get a whole genome sequence? Anybody know? Any thoughts? About $1,000. That's exactly. The first one cost $3 billion.
Wow.
Today, $1,000 whole genome sequence. If you accompany that with pharmacogenomics testing, you can get a real interesting, start to get a holistic look of a person. So I would suggest a great investment by the federal government. And as a result of that, if you look back 7, 8 years ago, the number of personalized precision medicines was in about a dozen or so. I mean, now there's been an exponential increase in the number of precision medicines that give real hope. I mean, again, we're in the business of improving the human condition. They give incredible hope for certain types of people with certain types of diseases. Lung cancer, certain lung cancers, melanoma, that if you were a stage 4 melanoma patient or lung cancer patient several years ago, you had no hope. But some of the work, the immunotherapy work that's been done, again, because of this significant investment that we made to better understand the human genome, I think has really been spectacular. And again, we're just in the very, very early innings of what this means in terms of precision medicine and better understanding the molecular biology of disease.
What role will something like artificial intelligence have in actually getting to that point where you understand more of that?
Well, I mean, artificial intelligence, as you know, it's been around for a while. It's not a new concept. It's been around for some time. I was talking about some of these questions with one of my colleagues, and he said, you can replace the chess player with a computer. That sounds okay, but would you replace the physician with a computer? And the answer is, in some things, probably yes, particularly radiological reads and things like that. But I think our view is that artificial intelligence is really going to help in decision support and really aid human interaction with patients. So I think it's a supplement to and will really help, again, with our objectives of how do we improve clinical outcomes, improve quality and safety, and be very precise with treatment. So I don't think it's a substitute for, I think it's a complement to.
You mentioned to me prior to this event that you could use AI to help radiologists actually read the x-rays, and that takes seconds rather than having someone actually look at the x-ray and trying to interpret.
And you get higher accuracy too. So I think, again, there'll be some substitution, But this is not something where you're going to show up and a physician's not there. I think it really is a complement to, an additive to the whole opportunity. And again, I think one of the earlier panelists talked about this proliferation of data. I mean, data by itself is interesting, but not necessarily relevant. And so again, how do we take all this data from various sources, and not just the information that we typically think about health, but we know that socioeconomic data, we know that environmental, we know there are lots of other types of data that is very impactful on a person's health. So how do we get that longitudinal, holistic look at a person's health so again, we can be able to better predict and prevent? I mean, again, if we can predict and prevent disease, obviously we're in a much better place than we have to treat disease. And again, that's this focus on personalized health, not just on the medicine, the sick part, which is really the healthcare system that we have today.
Mm-hmm. And with the expansion of the ecosystem of connected devices, how are you looking at security of data and devices differently?
Yeah, I mean, security is a big issue. And again, I think healthcare, we had this rush around meaningful use. We want to digitize records, which sounds like a great thing. We want everything electronic. We want workflow. We want interoperability. That's great, right? We're all for that. Well, we probably didn't do a great job when we were thinking about architecture up front once we were doing that around security. And one of our security folks likes to joke that I think the original architecture design was once you were through the front door, the dog was kind of sitting there and tell you where the safe is, where all the valuables inside the house. And I don't think we really thought through that as well as we needed to initially, again, because there was such a push to get to digitization of records, to centralize data, to provide standardization of protocols and such. So today, it's a huge issue. I mean, we've seen obviously enormous number of breaches inside the healthcare space. It's something that we spend a lot of money on, that we focus on very hard, because we possess obviously a lot of interesting information about a person's health. And it's also certainly a real interest at the board level too, to make sure that we can protect that data and that information. And it's not just for nefarious purposes. I mean, one of the, again, going back to the ecosystem, if we want people to do genetic testing, we want people to use the power of genomic science to be able to better predict and prevent health. But today, the ecosystem that exists, you cannot be discriminated for purposes of health, and you cannot be discriminated for purposes of employment. But a life insurer or a disability insurer can choose not to underwrite a policy based on information that you may have from some type of genetic sequencing, right? So, I mean, that information today legally can be used to discriminate against somebody. So again, the ecosystem has got to catch up. So it's not just nefarious purposes and use of information. It's also that information legally can be used to discriminate against you. So again, that ecosystem has got to catch up to the science and technology.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like the move when it comes to healthcare is really to empower the patients and give them the power and the encouragement to manage their own health. So where do you see that going within the next few years or so? Will there be a need for hospitals, doctors?
Well, unfortunately, disease is very, very tough, mm-hmm. and there will be a need for hospitals and doctors. I think one of the questions is, again, thinking back to that futurist who worked with me for me about 10 years ago, his whole point of view, again, information's at the center, not the hospital. And I think he's right. Also, I think at the center really is the empowered consumer, the empowered patient. I mean, who owns the information? I would argue that really is the person, the individual. It's not the healthcare system. It's not a hospital. We're just one of the plug-ins along the way. But that care is going to be done in so many different places, both inside and outside of healthcare system. It's really the consumer that should own their health information, and the integration of not only their health information, but other information that's relevant to their health should be that empowered consumer, in my view.
And the center is really on the cutting edge when it comes to technologies. So what are some of the focus areas in 2018 and going beyond 2018?
Well, I think on the science side, it really is around this precision medicine. And again, how can we use the power and the discovery around the human genome and genomic science, and not just genomics, but proteomics, which is a subset of omics, proteins and genes. You get to go back and do some biology here. But how do we use that to more precisely treat disease? Mm-hmm. And then how, again, can we use the power of the science and technology to be able to better predict and prevent disease? I mean, to give you a kind of what's different today, if 10 years ago, if a 40-year-old mother presented with breast cancer, obviously we're going to focus on her breast cancer and come up with a therapeutic. But today, with the understanding the advances in science and technology, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sequence that tumor, because we want to understand the molecular biology and characterization of that tumor. It's actually less important today. Oncologists will tell you where your cancer is than what's the molecular signature, if you will, of your cancer. So we want to come up with a very targeted therapy and approach to her disease. Well, what if she has two daughters that are 22 and 24? What if her mom had breast cancer, her sister had breast cancer? So those two daughters have a mom, a grandma, and an aunt who've had breast cancer. I mean, today we would advise the 22 and 24-year-old to go through genetic testing and to see if they have a BRCA1, BRCA2 gene. And then obviously that's information that's very relevant to their health. So if they were to come back and test positive, we know that there's going to be a much higher likelihood that they can develop breast cancer. Now, what we can't tell them today is when. So it's not just providing data and information, it's providing data and information and context. So we would make sure that they would have genetic counselors, working with them to help them make informed decisions. And those informed decisions could include just much more active monitoring, or they could make a decision to have a double mastectomy with reconstructive surgery. I mean, that's a big life decision. And so giving people information without interpretation and counseling is a wholly bad idea. So we don't do that. We don't provide people genetic information about themselves without providing with the genetic counselors to make sure they can understand the information and their options and make choices that are personal to them. That's something very different. Before we mapped the human genome, we wouldn't have had that capability. It's now something that we would do, again, treating not only the person who's sick, but also trying to keep those two other individuals, those two young women, from getting breast cancer in the first place, and that's the focus on health.
So what's next for you, and what are you planning on addressing? What will be your key area of focus in 2018?
Well, we have this 117-acre campus that we're in the process of going through significant renovations to the existing footprint, and then developing the campus over time. Our objective is to create a major life science, bioscience, international hub of innovation and discovery on this campus. You may have seen about a year ago, we announced an important partnership with the University of Virginia, a medical education partnership, a research partnership, and also innovation partnership. And we really see taking our clinical capabilities, our research capabilities, in conjunction with UVA's clinical research, medical education capabilities, and then other life science, bioscience entities, data, technology companies, and building out our own version of Kendall Square right here in the greater Washington, D.C. area.
Nice. So we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. Do we have our mic?
Anybody want to talk about molecular biology?
Okay. Steve.
I have a question. There's a lot of talk on the Hill here about revising, changing, repealing, whatever, the Affordable Care Act. Does Inova Hospital have any opinion on this? I'm sure you're monitoring it. And the other sort of part two of that question is, how would you characterize your relationship, a private sector's healthcare relationship with public sector healthcare folks?
Well, the second question is the public sector is terribly important because of this entity called CMS, which has not only Medicare and Medicaid, but has a big influence on commercial payers and how they look at reimbursement. So there's a very tight integration, I think, just given how powerful the federal government is in the health marketplace because of Medicare and Medicaid, and how commercial payers will follow a lot of what CMS does. So there is a tight integration. Obviously, we are a heavily regulated industry as well, so certainly the federal government, the impact of what the federal government does has an impact on us. On the Affordable Care Act, I mean, it's interesting because this is not to be political, but it did start to really change behavior, and I'll give you an example. Discharge, when you were discharged from a hospital, I mean, it was essentially a financial function, kind of a settling up, if you will, of who's paying for what, your insurance and so forth. And you did get discharge instructions, certain instructions related to your health. But truthfully, we were probably less focused on that. I mean, again, we were good stewards and gave people medications and things like that. And once you left the hospital, you went back to hopefully heal within your home. Well, this thing called avoidable readmissions, that if you come back within 30 days to a hospital, there's some presumption that it was an avoidable readmission. So that really changed the thinking around discharge. It wasn't just a financial function, it was a continuum of care, continuity of care function to make sure that once you left, since medication adherence is such a challenge in the United States for patients and in the world, but to make sure you're taking your medications, the right medications at the right time, to remotely monitor vitals, right, your health, to make sure you're following up with follow-up appointments. So we became much more engaged and much more intentional once you left our health system to make sure that you were continuing to get better. You were doing the things that were important to your health around medication adherence, understanding where you are from your health itself, follow-up visits and things like that. I mean, that was a big change because the impact of not doing that, if people come back, it's a cost to us, no revenue, so it hits directly the bottom line. So, there's an example that I really think forced us to think differently today. A big concern that we have is pre the Affordable Care Act that the really entry point to a healthcare system was the emergency room. It's the most expensive form of care. Most people that used to go there shouldn't be there. I mean, really ought to be acute types of things. But that was the entry point. That's a very, very expensive point of care for people to enter a healthcare system. So I think there's been more rationality since the Affordable Care Act. And so we're concerned. I think we're all concerned about, there are issues. Anytime you pass a major piece of legislation like the Affordable Care Act, some things with the benefit of hindsight are going to be good, some things with the benefit of hindsight are not, and you should be open to changing and modifying the things that don't work. But the idea that you scrap it with uncertainty about what's coming next, obviously that's a concern for all healthcare providers in the United States.
One more question?
No molecular biology questions?
Now you've scared them.
Yankees in 6. Severino's going to pitch well tomorrow night. With a name like Stottlemyre, this will show my age. He pitched for the Yankees a long time ago.
Amanda has a question here. The reporter with us.
Yeah, so what challenges do you face when you're trying to implement these technologies that you say face challenges with the environment that healthcare is in today? Do you face any challenges in your
we face, this is a huge change management. That's why I say it's kind of inside-out disruption. Because again, the healthcare system has principally been a sick system. We treat sick people. It's been very transactional. We see you when you're sick, but this holistic approach to health, it really includes when you're healthy, not just when you're sick, and not just transaction-based, is very, very different. So there's enormous change inside a healthcare system. And when you talk about things like genetics and genomics, even with exceptionally talented men and women who are clinicians, their genomics and genetics was about that thin in medical school. So, for example, on the pharmacogenomics side, one of the things I'm very proud of at our hospitals is, as part of the standard of care for any newborn baby born at an Inova hospital, you have the option as parents to opt in to have a genetic test, a pharmacogenomics test done in your newborn. Just a cheek swab, and it can, I think there's 7 genes, 21 drugs, and we can tell you, the parents and a pediatrician, that early on there may be some drugs that that child shouldn't take. An example is codeine. That's one of the drugs in the panel. Codeine is a drug that's given to young children for pain. Codeine can have certain outcomes. It can work, no side effect. It can not work, right, and not have side effects. Or you can have terrible side effects, including death. So why would we ever give a young child codeine when we know we can tell them whether they should take that drug or not? So the democratization of genomics is something that's very important to us, because I think one of the concerns is that this is something that's going to be available only to people of means. And so we've really tried to push in the democratization as well, so that in this instance, all babies, regardless of their parents, have access to something, if they choose to do it early on in life, that starts to begin to give a more holistic picture of their health going forward.
And
but it's a huge change management, both inside the healthcare system and outside. And just make one last comment. The payers, for example, the insurance companies, and when you meet with them, they're honest. How much experience, understanding you have genetics and genomics? And they'll go, about right here. So again, the science and technology always runs faster than public policy. It is galloping ahead of public policy when it comes to what's going on in the health space today.
It's interesting to see the rise of companies like 23andMe. You can actually swab your cheek and send it out, and for a couple of $100, you'll find out more about your your DNA and things
Yeah,
like that.
people.
Food tolerances to food allergies. I think it's amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Been-
Go Yankees.
Yeah. Go Yankees. Here's a little coffee cup.
Thank you very
So
much.
thank you.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve?
Thank you all for coming.